when you do anything for it?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure we know people like this. People do anything for money. You know, it doesn't even really matter so much of what, I mean, even if they don't need the money, they'll still do anything for the money. Why? Because that money represents something else. They're willing to go way further than anybody else, you know, for that thing. Yeah. And like we were saying, especially if these are things that represent something else. So for example, like poetry, it represents something. It's not just the act of writing, it's something else that's there. Seeking money. It isn't just about having money and buying nice stuff. There's something else that's going on there. If we love money, there's a good chance it's because we're trying to, and again, not just like buying stuff, but because we like to have that status. We like to have the idea that people will think very highly of us. Yeah. So the thing here about consequences is a big one. The idea of drinking is that it relieves us of consequences to a certain degree. Not that it relieves us from consequences in the real world, but it relieves us of the consequences of having to face the consequences, if this makes sense. You know? It's interesting, like you'll see, I was talking to someone about this one time, about how you'll hear people who they run into trouble, and all of a sudden they become religious when they run into trouble, and they start praying. And you're going to notice that people very rarely ever pray to have these things removed, for like to have the desire to do these terrible things removed from them. What we oftentimes pray for is to be free of the consequences of the things that we do. That's very different from being free from the desire to do certain things. It's the consequences that mess us up, and that's one of the rules, I guess you could say, of poetry or any art at all, generally, is that you can't care about the consequences. You have to just do the thing. You can't care about the consequences of what you write. But what if people are offended by this? What if people are bothered by this? You can't worry about that. Because if you self-censor like that, you're never going to create what you could create. You can't worry too much about, well, I'll leave it at that. And then if you can't create what you otherwise could create, there's no point in doing it at all. But what if I do this and people hate it? They probably will. They probably will. And you may end up dying and no one's ever going to know your art. But afterwards, maybe. But are you doing it because you want to be famous, or are you doing it because you're an artist? That's what you have to do. No? Yeah.
How drunk are they talking about? Like, how drunk?
I'm sorry, one time?
Like, how drunk are they talking about? Like, you know?
I don't know. I mean, I guess that's
We're talking about like people being drunk, but like, to what point?
right.
So a lot of people being drunk once, but like, to like, almost like blackout point.
Yeah, I get you. So I was using this example last period. So this. So this is like, let's say that's a line where you're completely sober. No alcohol, nothing to derange your senses. And these folks are usually pretty reasonable. And of course that's going to be a relative statement. That means that you have control over all of your faculties. Some people have more faculties than others. You'll see what I mean in just a minute. And then you get a little bit tipsy, let's say. And so your reason, your ability to assess and analyze starts to diminish. And this becomes problematic right here. This is where you get people who will say things, and like with a straight face, they'll say things like, bro, I'm telling you, I actually drive better when I've had something to drink. It's like, no, you don't. You don't. No, I'm telling you, man, you wouldn't understand because you haven't been there. I hear people talk about this kind of stuff all the time. It's like people who say, no, I work really great under pressure. You put me under a timeline, under a deadline, I get stuff done. No, you don't work well under pressure. The ability to work under pressure is a very specific character trait that very, very, very few people have. What actually happens is that I give you a deadline and say, all right, August 1st or whatever. We sit there and go, cool. And then July 27th happens, 28th, 29th, 30th, 31st. And all of a sudden at 6 o'clock on the day before something is due, we go, oh shit, that's due tomorrow. And then we rush and we rush and we get it done. And then we run in like just as the deadline happens and go, there you go. And then you go, see, I work well under pressure. No. Now all that means is that you don't work unless there's pressure. That's different from working well under pressure. If that same effort that you put in those last 6 hours, you instead put in the first 6 hours, And then you took those 6 hours and you created whatever you're going to create. And then over the course of the next few days, you edited, revised, made it better, improved, tweaked a little bit. The final product that you turned in would be spectacular, rather than what you're really turning in, which is just a rough draft. And a rough draft is never as good as a second, third, or even 10th draft. So, but we'll convince ourselves, no, but I work well. That's because you don't know any other way. You don't know what you don't know. The same is true when someone says something like, no, I do better when I've had a few drinks. No, you don't. Well, why does a person think that they do? Because this is where your judgment starts to get impaired. This is the thing that, the hallmark of this is impaired judgment. Some of which is going to be things like an unrealistic sense of self. In other words, this is a person who gets like a happy drunk. Yeah, what's up? And they don't really care much for consequences. They don't realize how annoying they're being to people around them. Now, some people will think they're fun or whatever, but most people are like, oh my God, this person again, whatever. And they just don't realize it because, you know, when your judgment is impaired, you don't realize that you kind of swerved a little bit into a lane. You don't realize that you stopped a little bit past a line. Why? Because your judgment's impaired. You know? So once your judgment's impaired, well, it's just obvious you can't make good judgments. Now when you get to a point of being, completely drunk, and you have almost no sense of judgment whatsoever, that's when you start doing things like, I can drive home, and you get the keys and you start walking. If you saw yourself sober, you would very directly say, that person can't drive that way. If you took a video of that person driving afterwards when they're sober, they would look at it and say, no, I am not a better driver when I do these things. You know? And by the way, it's not just impaired judgment also here, it's also a desire. We want to be able to say that we drive better that way. Because if we say that and we believe it, then that gives us a license to do it. But if we really analyze it, we realize, no, it doesn't help you with it whatsoever. So, this is right here a sense where your judgment is completely impaired. Now, there's a thing though. You'll find that a lot of great art, for some reason, seems to happen here, and not so much happening here. And that tells us that art is something that it almost seems like our ability to analyze gets in the way of creating these things. Now what happens sometimes is you'll make something when you're impaired, we'll say, and then afterwards when you've sobered up and you can look at it and go, wow, that's interesting. I wouldn't have come up with that idea if I wasn't impaired. That's because there are inhibitions in your mind. There are things that are telling you, oh, you can't think that, you can't say that, you can't do that. But once those things are gone, and that window is open, now you can allow ideas to flood through, and you just make it. You don't care about the consequences for it. And then once you've sobered up, then you can look at it in retrospect and say, okay, from this perspective now, I can improve upon it. I can make it better. You know, something that you wrote, something that a dance that you made, a poem that you wrote, whatever it is. Now you can go back and improve it. It's called emotions recollected in tranquility. Afterwards, I can improve upon it. Because the first draft, again, is never as good as the revisions. And then, you understand, therefore, that there's something about art that's not so much about reason. It's more about feeling it. It's more about emotion. You know? And that's what art, the value of art really is. There is intellectual art. Interestingly enough, I think you're going to find, by the way, that most intellectual art is crap. And I mean that like I don't mean that in the sense of like it's not good. I mean it in the sense that it's bullshit. Anybody ever heard of Andy Warhol, any chance? I was mentioning this last period. Andy Warhol is an artist. I'm sorry, he's an artist. He was until he died. When we measure intelligence in people, we measure intelligence is a thing called IQ. And an average IQ is 100. So if your IQ is 100, if it's within 95 and 105, you're considered within the standard deviation of normal. When we refer to somebody as being retarded, that means they have an IQ of around 70 or so. That's the line for mental retardation. A genius level IQ is 140 and above after that. You're looking at like 160, you're looking at like Einstein, Stephen Hawking, Shakira. Legit. I'm serious about that, by the way. I'm not making that up. Andy Warhol's IQ was 80. 80. So because he had such a low IQ, what did he create? He created stuff like, he made paintings of Campbell soup cans. That was it. And people would be like, it's so deep. And he'd be like, it's a Campbell soup can. He made a movie, he made a film of, he called it like reality cinematography. He made a movie one time, he just set up a camera, and the movie is of a guy eating a cheeseburger. That's it. That's all that happens. He has another movie, it's a 7.5-hour movie I think it is, of a person sleeping. He just set the camera and videoed someone sleeping. And then there were people who were very smart, very intellectual, who came along and were like, it says so much. It was bullshit. It was a guy eating a cheeseburger. It was someone sleeping. But, yeah, and he wasn't like some hyper genius who was creating brilliant art. He was a low IQ person who was just making stuff like Campbell soup cans and filming people eating cheeseburgers. But then it was the people who came along and were like, well, don't you see the art in that? And you're like, no. But that's because you don't have a mind for it. It allows us to feel like we're better than other people because we see the value in a painting of a Campbell soup can. And celebrities from all over the world would go see Andy Warhol and all that stuff. He carried a camera around him. He's the one who came up with the phrase that everyone will be famous for 15 minutes. The 15 minutes of fame that comes from him. Not a particularly intelligent guy, but it seemed to work in his favor. Why? Because he didn't have the intellect to be able to inhibit him from doing, like, who the hell would ever paint a Campbell soup can and go, this is going to be great, this is going to change the art world. You'd have to be either really dumb or really smart to believe that that's going to change the art world. Nobody in between is ever going to get that. And then, this is the person who thinks of it, and then this is the person who makes it happen and does it. And so a lot of art is going to come from this inability, I'll just say, a lot of art's going to come from this removing of the inhibitions, I'm going to say. You can't sit there and go, no one's going to like this. Who cares if anyone likes it? Are you an artist or are you a people pleaser? Something you're going to find is that in art, in life, in business, especially in business, man, and you'll hear me say this throughout the school year, the audience is bullshit. The audience is bullshit. What I mean by that is, you guys ever eat ragu, spaghetti sauce?
Yes.
You ever have Prego spaghetti sauce? Okay. So I'm going to screw up some details of this story, but the spirit of it is all true. Back in the 80s, the ragu company, that makes the marinara sauce, spaghetti sauce, they owned something of like 80%, 90% of the spaghetti sauce market in the United States. The company Prego was essentially being put out of business by ragu. So they hired a guy to come along and say, hey, can you make a spaghetti sauce that can compete with ragu? And this guy's like, sure. I remember his last name. His first name was Bob. I remember that much. I'll think of his last name. But anyway, so he put together a focus group, a bunch of people, a panel of, I think it was 12 people, 14 people, and asked them, what do you want your marinara sauce to taste like? And this makes sense. You go to the audience who you're trying to sell it to, and you ask them, what do you want? And the audience says, we want, and they describe what they want. And so you go, perfect. And he's a chemist. So he goes back to the lab, and he makes spaghetti sauces that reflect exactly what they said. And then he takes it to them. He does taste tests, and guess what happens?
They hated it.
Yeah, they hated it. Ragu won. God damn it. He did it again. Ragu won. 67 panels he did this with. And Ragu beat them every single time. Finally, he just said, fuck it. He did the complete opposite of what everyone was saying. Where everyone was saying they want like a smooth marinara sauce, he just like chopped up a bunch of vegetables and threw it in there and goes, and that's what ragu is. It's a marinara sauce with like a bunch of spices and like chunks of green pepper and chunks of tomatoes, and he puts it in there and he does a taste test, and it won. And it was the complete opposite of what the audience said that they wanted. And so we find this in market research that when you go to audiences and you ask them, what do you actually really want? The audience doesn't know what it wants. The audience is bullshit. They'll say, we want this, not that. If you go to a person and ask them, what kind of coffee do you like? They'll say, I want a coffee that's bold flavored, it's rich, it's dark brewed. And you ask them, would you like us to pour like a whole bunch of sugary cream and milk in there? No, that's gross, man. I want to, but somehow Starbucks makes billions every year by giving people the opposite of what they thought they wanted. Because sometimes what you have to do is go, try this. And it's not something they ever would have tried before. And then they try it and they go, wow, I'll pay $5 a cup for this. And they do. You can't trust what the audience is saying. If you're an artist and you're running around and you're like, let me figure out what the audience wants. No one's going to buy your art. Unless you're Andy Warhol, I guess. But for the most part, you have to realize the audience is bullshit. You have to make a song, go to them and say, here's the song. And then they have to hear it. That's the hard part. Get people willing to hear it. And once they hear it, wow, that's different. And if you ever hear something that's completely different from what you're used to, it stands out to you in some way. But if you've never heard something before, how can you tell me that that's the thing that you want? You can't. You have to experience it before you know that you want it. And so this is what an artist will do. They'll make something, not because they want an audience, but just because it's inside of you. And then you make it, and because you're not allowing yourself to be inhibited, you're not worried about the consequences of it. Well, now you make something, you put it out there, and you don't really care if the audience likes it or not. Again, you're creating without consequence, and then the audience hears it, and they're like, that's pretty good. I like that. Yeah, wow, that's so different. It doesn't sound like anything. Exactly. Exactly. And the same is true about a lot of things. I mean, if you're going to, if I were to ask you what kind of a business you wanted to open up, most of us would repeat a business that we like. Scanlon, if you're going to open up if I open up some international city, what would I open up? I don't know, a Buffalo Wings place? Are there any Buffalo Wing places in National City? No. Yeah. Are they any good? Yeah. So I gotta compete with not even with wings and things. I gotta compete with epic wings and things. That's a different kind of wings and things. I gotta compete with Wingstop. Yeah, there's a bunch of places here in National City. I have to be able to look at that and go, there's something that they're doing wrong that I can do better and that the audience is going to appreciate. If I can't come up with that, it's silly of me to open up a wing place. Instead, I'm going to open up a fusion place. A place that sells tacos with buffalo wings in them. Does that sound good? You got to try it, bro. I don't know, man. It seems kind of weird. Try it. And then you try it, and you're like, wow, this is the greatest thing to ever happen. This is better than democracy. Maybe. Or maybe you taste it as trash. But the idea is that it has to be something that's different. Otherwise, the people who are already doing it are doing fine with it. You know? This is why, you ever notice how, think about how many taco shops you know of. Think about how many names of taco shops you know. Do you actually know the names of the places, or do you just say, oh, the taco shop down the street? I'm shocked. I go to taco places, and sometimes I'm shocked to find out that it's part of a chain. It's like, that's a Sombreros? Is it really? They didn't even realize it, because they all seem the same after a while. And so there's no niche for that, of course. But there's no niche for that in art. It's got to be something else. Questions, comments, concerns, complaints, criticisms, critiques? I kept it happy, so I could say Happy Friday.